follow orders this time. Pinky swear.
Welcome back to another officer spotlight. We're going to do Rapier, or Yi Qiming. Rapier, as we shall call him because it's easier to pronounce, is a light tank field officer. So this should be good because it brings light tanks back into the mix. His first ability, Show of Force, a tactical skill, which deals up to 1500 coefficient damage and increases the critical strike rate of the unit for 8 seconds by up to 20%. This gets a solid 5. If you know about the critical strike rating and how it works in regards to other systems of damage within the game, you'll understand why it's getting a 5 out of 5. His second ability, Tactical Mobility, increases the firepower of the officer's tanks and helicopters by up to 30%. If this officer is in a light tank, this troop's firepower is increased by an additional up to 20%. Now the firepower affects multiple things. It affects the damage, it affects the load time as well. So that's pretty good. You know, you're looking at a potential buff there of 50% firepower. So, you know, there aren't many officers that will give you that. That's a straight up 5 out of 5 as well. Meld into the shadows. Normal attacks launched by this officer's troop deal up to an additional 15% attack damage buff. And it gives you a further critical strike rating. And obviously critical strike rating is chance on hit to generate a critical strike, which is 150% of base damage. So this guy, you combine that with the first skill, his special ability, he's already got 40% critical strike rating when he's awakened for 150% of base damage. I'm afraid that's got to be another 5. If you're rolling a light tank, at this stage, we're only 3 out of the 5 in. You need to be running this officer. Animosity, his last passive. Whenever this officer's tank or helicopter troop lands a critical strike, so again, we're working on critical strike rating, it gains 1% bonus to damage for 8 seconds and can stack up to 5 times. Critical strike rating in this game gets massively overlooked by people. I see a lot of people rolling it in air units, but I don't see anyone rolling it in ground units. We're talking 150%, and then an additional, with this officer, an additional 5% for 8 seconds that can stack up to another 5 times. That's a 25% buff. You know, that's got to be... it's got to be another 5. It can't not be another 5 if you're building towards a critical strike rating light tank. This guy is perfect in every sense of the word for damage output. His awakened ability. Whenever this officer's tank or helicopter troop lands a critical strike, it gains 5% bonus damage for 8 seconds and can stack up to 5 times at max stacks. The troop deals an additional skill damage whenever possible, landing a critical strike coefficient of 400 and can be triggered once every 4 seconds. So you're looking at the ability, not the tactical, but we're looking at the special skill getting a buff here. Now typically it's the tactical skill that gets a buff. We are looking at a free coefficient damage output of 400, so that puts his coefficient total up to 1900. I feel like this should have been a tactical ability to increase the tactical coefficient output of by 400 on a critical strike, for example, for the next 8 seconds. I think that would have made more sense. But at the same time, I can see why they've done this, because if you do that, you've just made it ridiculously powerful. Now, light tanks, we all know that light tanks are famous for their stun and slow builds. This is moving more towards a damaging build, which would make it more effective as an anti-air unit. And we all know that as anti-air units, light tanks kinda suck. So with the 150% damage increase from a critical strike rating, you can see that maybe we're entering pretty good territory for anti-air defense. I do have a light tank now. I do have this guy equipped for his coefficient damage. He's not optimally trained yet, but we are working on it. But I will give this ability a 4. It could have got a 5 had it been tied into the tactical, but it's tied into the special instead, which means it's very hard to awaken him and then use him as a trained officer. Because if you're awakening him and you then don't use him, you're kind of losing out on that animosity that he gets. So his final score is 4.8. He's a near perfect officer, but this comes with a caveat that you're building him as a critical strike build and you're putting him on a light tank. And as I've said, I haven't done the former, I have done the latter. I do think he would be very good. And I also think he'd be very good if you paired him with, say, Warrior Wiz, who also uses a lot of critical strike bonuses. And then you can obviously train in more critical strike bonuses. Don't discount the abilities you can use with critical strike. Yeah, he's pretty good.